Balanced and unbalanced growth advocates focus on preventing or overcoming coordination failure. Michael Kramer, 1993, uses the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger as a metaphor for coordinating production in the O-ring theory of economic development. The Challenger had thousands of components, but it exploded because the temperature at which it was launched was so low that one component, the O-rings, malfunctioned. In a similar fashion, Kramer proposes a production function in which production consists of many tasks, either simultaneous or sequential, all of which must be successfully completed for the product to have full value. Taiwan and South Korea, otherwise ready for takeoff in the mid-1960s, relied on government action to override coordination failure. Both countries have a reasonably skilled labor force but a low endowment of physical capital, especially for taking advantage of scale economies. Additionally, some labor skills are not available locally and some technologies are not readily transferable internationally. Taiwan's government took the initial steps in establishing enterprises such as plastics, textiles, fibers, steel, and electronics. In some instances, such as plastics, the state firm was handed over to private entrepreneurs on completion. Korea's government provided the initiative, subsidized capital, and guaranteed markets to chaebols, such as Hyundai and Lucky Goldstar, allowing them to internalize spillovers from one affiliate to another. For example, Hyundai used its cement plant to train its managers with background in construction, before assigning them to other manufacturing affiliates. For Mackey, Romer, and Weil, 1992, human capital, and for Romer, endogenous, originating internally, technology, when added to physical capital and labor in neoclassical growth theory, are important factors contributing to economic growth. The purpose of the Lewis-Ranis model is to explain how economic growth gets started in a less developed country with a traditional agricultural sector and an industrial capitalist sector. In the Lewis-Ranis model, economic growth occurs because of the increase in the size of the industrial sector, which accumulates capital, relative to the subsistence agricultural sectors, which amasses no capital at all. The source of capital in the industrial sector is profits from the low wages paid and unlimited supply of surplus labor from traditional agriculture. Urban industrialists increase their labor supply by attracting workers from agriculture to migrate to urban areas when wages there exceed rural agricultural wages. Sir W. Arthur Lewis elaborates on this explanation in his explanation of labor transfer from agriculture to industry in a newly industrializing country. In contrast to those economists writing since the early 1970s, who have been concerned about over-urbanization, Lewis, writing in 1954, is concerned about possible labor shortages in the expanding industrial sector. Lewis believes in zero, or negligible, marginal productivity of labor in subsistence agriculture, a sector virtually without capital and technological progress. Yet he contends that the wage, W, in agriculture is positive at subsistence, SWS. For this to be true, it is essential only that the average product of labor be at a subsistence level, as agricultural workers divide the produce equally among themselves until food availability is above subsistence. Lewis feels equilibrium wages in agriculture stay at WS through the classical mechanism of the iron law of wages, in which higher wages are brought down by population growth, and lower wages raised as output spread over a smaller population is reduced by an increased mortality rate. For the more capital-intensive urban industrial sector to attract labor from the rural area, it is essential to pay WS plus a 30% inducement, or WK, the capitalist wage. This higher wage compensates for the higher cost of living as well as the psychological cost of moving to a more regimented environment. At WK the urban employer can attract an unlimited supply of unskilled rural labor. The employer will hire this labor up to the point QL1, where the value of its extra product, or the left marginal revenue product curve MRPL1, equals the wage WK. The total wages of the workers are equal to OQL1, the quantity of labor, multiplied by WK, the wage, that is, rectangle OK1 ba. The capitalist earns the surplus, ABC in figure, the amount between the wage and that part of the marginal product curve above the wage. Lewis assumes that the capitalist saves the entire surplus, profits, interest, and rent, and the worker saves nothing. Furthermore, he suggests that all the surplus is reinvested, increasing the amount of capital per worker and thus the marginal product of labor to MRPL2, so that more labor QL2 can be hired at wage rate WK. This process enlarges the surplus, adds to capital formation, raises labor's marginal productivity, increases the labor hired, enlarges the surplus, and so on, through the cycle until all surplus labor is absorbed into the industrial sector. Beyond this point QL3, the labor supply curve, SLK, is upward sloping and additional laborers can be attracted only with a higher wage. As productivity increases beyond MRPL3 to MRPL4, the MRPL, or demand for labor, curve intersects the labor supply curve at a wage weight and at a quantity of labor QL4 in excess of surplus rural labor. In the Lewis model, capital is created by using surplus labor, with little social cost. Capital goods are created without giving up the production of consumer goods. However, to finance surplus labor, additional credit may sometimes be needed. The significance of Lewis's model is that growth takes place as a result of structural change. An economy consisting primarily of a subsistence agricultural sector, which does not save, is transformed into one predominantly in the modern capitalist sector, which does save. As the relative size of the capitalist sector grows, the ratio of profits and other surplus to national income grows. Critics question the theoretical underpinning of the Lewis model, the assumption of an unlimited labor supply. In the early 21st century, China, with substantial rural populations, may be the closest to an unlimited labor supply. They believe the capitalist wage rate may rise before all surplus rural labor is absorbed. As workers with zero marginal productivity migrate from the subsistence agricultural sector, those workers remaining in this sector will then divide constant output among fewer persons, resulting in a higher wage. Industrial wages, then, must increase to motivate rural workers to migrate. Lewis's critics argue that the larger industrial labor force contributes to greater food demand, but the capacity to produce food is unchanged. Thus, food prices rise. Accordingly, the industrial sector must increase wages to pay for the increased price of food. Lewis overestimates the extent that the availability of cheap rural migrant labor can stimulate industrial growth. How can LDCs maintain subsistence output per farm worker in the midst of population expansion? John and Gustav Ranis, in their modification of the Lewis model, contend that the agricultural sector must grow, through technological progress, for output to grow as fast as population. Technical change increases output per hectare to compensate for the increase in labor per land, which is a fixed resource. Gustav Ranis and John Ch. 1961, and Ranis 1964, label WK from 0 to QL3 an institutional wage supported by non-market factors such as the government minimum wage or labor union pressure. This institutional wage can remain infinitely elastic even when the marginal revenue productivity of labor is greater than 0. This wage remains at the same level as long as marginal productivity is less than the wage. However, the threshold for both agricultural and industrial sectors occurs when the marginal revenue productivity in agriculture equals the wage. At this point, the turning point or commercialization point, industry abandons the institutional wage, and together with agriculture, must pay the market rate. As with the Lewis model, the advent of fully commercialized agriculture and industry ends industrial growth, or what Ranis labels the takeoff into self-sustained growth. One problem is to avoid increasing the average product of labor in agriculture and the industrial institutional wage that would halt industrial expansion. And Ranis solve this with a sleight of hand. The LDC maintains a constant institutional wage until QL3 but at the expense of realism. Each migrating farm worker takes his or her own subsistence bundle to the industrial sector. How do Ranis prevent rises in food prices, and the agricultural terms of trade, from increasing the industrial wage? They propose a balanced growth between agriculture and industry. However, agricultural growth increases farm income, undermining the restraints on the institutional wage. Africa, Asia, and Latin America were not of major interest to Marx. He regarded production in these regions as feudal and backward compared to the more progressive modes of capitalism. Thus, he saw the introduction of European capitalism in these regions as beneficial. But in the 20th century, Marxian analysis came to encompass an international class struggle, including the conflict between rich and poor countries. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who not only furnished intellectual and organizational leadership for the revolutionary takeover of power by the Communist Party in Russia in October 1917 but was also chairman of the party from then until his death in 1924, provided much of this new Marxian revision. He argued that it was essential to recognize the difference between the monopoly capitalism of his period and the competitive capitalism of Marx's day. According to Lenin, a logical outgrowth of the monopoly stage of industrial and financial capitalism is the imperialist domination of poor countries by rich countries. The late U.S. Marxist Paul A. Baran incorporated Lenin's concepts of imperialism and international class conflict into his theory of economic growth and stagnation. For Baran, capitalist revolution, homegrown variety, in LDCs was unlikely because of Western economic and political domination, especially in the colonial period. Capitalism arose not through the growth of small competitive firms at home but through the transfer from abroad of advanced monopolistic business. Baran felt that as capitalism took hold, the bourgeoisie, business and middle classes, in LDCs, lacking the strength to spearhead thorough institutional change for major capital accumulation, would have to seek allies among other classes. Thus, in certain instances, the bourgeoisie would ally itself with the more moderate leaders of the workers and peasants to form a progressive coalition with a New Deal orientation, such as the Congress Party governments under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, 1947–64, in India. At the outset, such a popular movement would be essentially democratic, anti-feudal, and anti-imperialist and in support of domestic capitalism. However, the indigenous capitalist middle classes would ultimately be either unwilling or unable to provide the leadership for a sustained economic development that also would greatly reduce poverty and liberate the masses. In time, the bourgeoisie, frightened by the threat of labor radicalism and populist upheaval and the possible expropriation of their property, would be forced into an alliance with the landed interests and the foreign bourgeoisie in their midst, whose governments could provide economic and military assistance to stave off impending disaster. The differences within this counter-revolutionary coalition would not interfere with the overriding common interest in preventing socialism. Even so, the coalition would be unable to raise the rate of capital accumulation significantly. A progressive income tax system to eliminate non-essential consumption, channeling savings from the landed aristocracy into productive investment, and undertaking substantial public investment in sectors in which private capital does not venture, in which monopolistic controls block expansion, or in which infrastructure is required, would be beyond the coalition's ability or desire. Thus, this conservative alliance thrusts the popular forces even further along the road of radicalism and revolt, leading to further polarization. Finally, Baran theorizes that the only way out of the impasse may be worker and peasant revolution, expropriating land and capital, and establishing a new regime based on the ethos of collective effort, and the creed of the predominance of the interests of society over the interests of a selected few. Baran 1957. More succinctly presented in Baran 1952. Although Baran's approach explains the difficulties that some reformed capitalist LDCs face in spurring economic development, the theory fails to examine a number of economic and political conflicts of interest. Although there are certainly many local agents, managers, merchants, industrialists, bureaucrats, and politicians who benefit considerably from foreign-controlled capital and technology, there are also some local capitalists whose interests compete with foreign business. These capitalists and their allies frequently lead movements for independence. For example, Côte d'Ivoire cocoa farmers who opposed the formation of French cocoa plantations were major supporters of the Nationalist Democratic Party in the 1950s, After independence, these nationalist elements may become even stronger as colonial economic ties are gradually weakened. Economic policy under a coalition of domestic capitalists, politicians, and bureaucrats may erode the power of foreign capital. The allies and competitors of foreign business people are often locked in economic and political conflict. Baran also ignores the probability that power is more frequently transferred from one elite to another when revolution occurs, rather than from the advantaged classes to the politically dispossessed masses. Very few of the Soviet and Chinese revolutionary leaders were workers or poor peasants. For Baran, 1952–84, the society closest to a new social ethos, that will become the spirit and guide of a new age is the Soviet Union after 1917. He argues that despite the political violence used by Stalin in the 1930s, and the loss of several million lives during this period, the collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union was the only possible approach to economic growth, given an irrational and illiterate peasantry. However, he ignores the substantial growth in both agriculture and industry from 1921 to 1928 under the Soviet new economic policy of market socialism. This policy consisted of widespread reliance on market prices, limited private ownership, especially in agriculture, and state ownership of most of the largest industrial enterprises. After Stalin began collectivization, agricultural production declined, the peasant's standard of living dropped significantly, and even the savings agriculture contributed to the industrial sector probably did not increase. There were widespread violence, famine, forced labor, and purges during collectivization. Although the performance of Soviet agriculture since then has improved, the relatively slow growth in agricultural productivity has frustrated Soviet leadership in its attempt to increase average consumption levels to those expected in a high-income economy. Baran does not ask whether a more gradual, less centralized approach to agricultural production would have resulted in more rapid development. But perhaps such a question cannot be resolved. Some historians argue that raising living levels, increasing life expectancy, and improving literacy during economic growth have inevitable human costs. Squalor, poverty, an unhealthy environment, a high infant mortality rate, and a high premature death rate among the working poor may mark the economic transition, as occurred during Europe's Industrial Revolution, or by the disruption, famine, and death among peasants in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. But, in any case, the human costs cannot be avoided. Several Marxian economists have argued that the Russian Revolution of 1917 did not erase divergent class interests. One French economist argues that the USSR abandoned the socialist road, creating a new ruling class, made up of the Communist Party, the Presidium, and the bureaucracy, whose economic interests are antagonistic to those of Soviet workers. Bettelheim 1978. Celso Furtado, 1970, 1968, a Brazilian economist with the UN Economic Committee for Latin America, was an early contributor to the Spanish and Portuguese literature and dependency theory in the 1950s and 1960s. According to him, since the 18th century, global changes in demand resulted in a new international division of labor in which the peripheral countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America specialized in primary products in an enclave controlled by foreigners while importing consumer goods that were the fruits of technical progress in the central countries of the West. The increased productivity and new consumption patterns in peripheral countries benefited a small ruling class and its allies, less than a tenth of the population, who cooperated with the LDCs to achieve modernization, economic development among a modernizing minority. The result is peripheral capitalism, a capitalism unable to generate innovations and dependent for transformation upon decisions from the outside. Many scholars were viewed that modernization in LDCs as simply the adoption of economic and political systems developed in Western Europe and North America. For Frank, the presently developed countries were never underdeveloped, although they may have been undeveloped. His basic thesis is that underdevelopment does not mean traditional, that is, non-modern, economic, political, and social institutions but LDC subjection to the colonial rule and imperial domination of foreign powers. In essence, Frank sees underdevelopment as the effect of the penetration of modern capitalism into the archaic economic structures of the Third World. More plainly stated, the economic development of the rich countries contributes to the underdevelopment of the poor. Development in an LDC is not self-generating nor autonomous but ancillary. The LDCs are economic satellites of the highly developed regions of Northern America and Western Europe in the international capitalist system. The Afro-Asian and Latin American countries least integrated into this system tend to be the most highly developed. Brazil best illustrates the connection between the satellite relationship and underdevelopment. Since the 19th century, the growth of major cities, São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, has been satellite development, largely dependent on outside capitalist powers, especially Britain and the United States. As a result, regions in interior Brazil have become the satellites of these two cities and, through them, of these Western capitalist countries. Frank suggests that satellite countries experience their greatest economic development when they are least dependent on the world capitalist system. Thus, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Chile grew most rapidly during World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II, when trade and financial ties with major capitalist countries were weakest. Significantly, the most underdeveloped regions today are those that have had the closest ties to Western capitalism in the past. They were the greatest exporters of primary products to, and the biggest sources of capital for, developed countries and were abandoned by them when for one reason or another business fell off. It is an error, Frank feels, to argue that the development of the underdeveloped countries will be stimulated by indiscriminately transferring capital, institutions, and values from developed countries. He suggests that, in fact, the following economic activities have contributed to underdevelopment, not development. 1. Replacing indigenous enterprises with technologically more advanced, global, subsidiary companies. 2. Forming an unskilled labor force to work in factories and mines and on plantations. 3. Recruiting highly educated youths for junior posts in the colonial administrative service. 4. Workers migrating from villages to foreign-dominated urban complexes. 5. Opening the economy to trade with, and investment from, developed countries. According to Frank, a third world country can develop only by withdrawing from the world capitalist system. Perforce, such a withdrawal means a large reduction in trade, aid, investment, and technology from the developed capitalist countries. Richard Duboff, 2003, argues that the military superiority of major capitalist countries, primarily the United States, is the key to support for the world's open trade and investment in LDC dependence. Many economic historians would agree with Frank that colonies paid dearly for economic dependency under foreign rule. They grant that development was not self-directed. Production was directed toward external rather than domestic needs. Economic policies inhibited local industrial activity and led to uneven ethnic and regional economic progress, and elite-oriented to foreign interests arose. However, these costs were offset, at least in part, by the development of schools, roads, railroads, and administrative service under the colonial powers. Moreover, it is unfair to compare the experience of these countries under colonialism to what might have happened without foreign domination. The internal economic and political weaknesses of Afro-Asian and Latin American countries during the last part of the 19th and early part of the 20th centuries probably made it inevitable that most of them would be economically dependent on some foreign power. The acute underdevelopment of Afghanistan, Thailand, and Ethiopia, which were not colonized, although the West influenced them, suggests that colonialism by itself may not have had so negative an impact as Frank indicates. Taiwan and South Korea both experienced annual real growth of at least 7%, World Bank 1994, Nafziger 1997, and decreased income inequality from 1960 to 1980 while being highly dependent on trade, assistance, and investment from the United States and other capitalist countries. Some changes to cut dependence have not had the anticipated effect. Dependence took new forms in the last quarter of the 20th century. Beginning in the mid-1970s, Nigeria took several steps that, on the face of it, should have reduced its dependence on the West. The Lagos government cut substantially the share of its trade with the colonial power, Britain. Lagos acquired majority equity holdings in local petroleum extracting, refining, and distribution and promulgated an indigenization decree shifting the majority of ownership in manufacturing from foreign to indigenous hands. But these measures did not greatly reduce dependence on the West. Nigeria's trade was still virtually all with capitalist LDCs, with the United States replacing Britain as the chief trading partner. In contrast to more diversified exports in the 1960s, petroleum comprised more than 90% of export value since 1974. Moreover, only 15 to 20% of the petroleum industry's total expenditure on goods and services was spent on locally produced items, which do not include most basic requirements, such as drilling rigs, platforms, heavy structures, underwater engineering systems, and other advanced technologies. There are, however, several instances in which countries might have developed more rapidly with less dependence on foreign economic initiative. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Honduras, Guatemala, Zaire, and the Philippines were probably hurt by excessive economic dependence on the United States and other Western countries. But the solution to these problems is not withdrawal from the world capitalist system but, rather, a more selective policy in dealings with capitalist countries. Trade, economic aid, capital movements, and technological borrowing from developed countries should be such that investment is directed into priority industries. Discouraging foreign monopoly power, encouraging domestic enterprise, preventing heavy debt burdens, avoiding substantial technological dependence on outsiders, and protecting infant domestic industries should all be part of this selective policy. What characteristics of dependent economies are not found in independent ones? Frank defines dependence in a circular manner. The LDCs are underdeveloped because they are dependent. But the features Frank concentrates on in defining dependence are those characteristics of underdevelopment. Thus, the theory does not offer an independent and verifiable explanation of the processes causing underdevelopment. Finally, most developed countries are also dependent on foreign economic ties. In fact, Canada and Belgium may be more dependent on foreign investment than India or Pakistan, but Frank does not consider them dependent countries. Rather than divide the world into dependent and independent countries, it seems more sensible to think in terms of a continuum of dependence from the weakest LDC to the most powerful capitalist country. In the 1980s, the governments of economic conservatives, American President Ronald Reagan, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and a series of Japanese Liberal Democratic Party prime ministers coincided with a neoclassical counter-revolution in economic policy and analysis. The governments of the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, high-income members of the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development, OECD, largely supportive of the market, privatization, supply-side economics, and other neoclassical positions, were influential as majority holders into international financial institutions created at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in July 1944 as part of a new post-World War II international economic order, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, IMF. The World Bank, or International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, initially envisioned as a source for loans to areas devastated during World War II, is now the major source of development loans to LDCs. The IMF, an agency charged with promoting exchange stability to provide short-term credit for international balance of payments deficits, is a lender of last resort, where borrowers agree to adopt acceptable adjustment policies. The neoclassicists contend that slow or negative growth results from poor resource allocation from non-market prices and excessive LDC state intervention. They argue that promoting competitive free markets, privatizing public enterprises, supporting exports and free international trade, liberalizing trade and exchange rates, allowing exchange rates to attain a market clearing rate, removing barriers to foreign investment, rewarding domestic savings, reducing government spending and monetary expansion, and removing regulations and price distortions in financial, resource, and commodity markets will spur increased efficiency and economic growth. The World Bank and IMF point to South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia as examples of the free market approach that governments have played major roles in their economic development. Neoclassicism's policies are reflected in the Washington Consensus, a term coined by Washington's Institute of International Economics economist John Williamson, 1993-1994. This consensus includes the World Bank, the IMF, and the U.S. government, based in Washington, D.C., and other major bank I.M.F. shareholders, the high-income OECD governments, although perhaps not the OECD bureaucracy itself in Paris, France. The following are the components of the neoclassical Washington Consensus. 1. Price decontrol. Neoclassicists favor immediate lifting of controls on commodity, factor, and currency prices. 2. Fiscal discipline. Budget deficits of governments or central banks should be small enough to be financed without using inflationary financing. 3. Public expenditure priorities. LDCs should reduce government spending, and redirect expenditures from politically sensitive areas such as administration, defense, indiscriminate subsidies, and white elephants to infrastructure, primary health, and education. 4. Tax reform. This includes broadening of the tax base, improved tax administration, sharpening of tax incentives, reduced marginal tax rates, diminished tax evasion and loopholes, and taxing interest on assets held abroad. 5. Financial liberalization. The immediate objectives are to abolish preferential interest rates for privileged borrowers and charge nominal interest rates in excess of inflation rates, whereas the ultimate objective is market-determined interest rates to improve capital's allocative efficiency. 6. Exchange rates. Countries need a unified, competitive rate to spur a rapid expansion in exports. 7. Trade liberalization. LDCs should replace quantitative restrictions with tariffs, and progressively reduce tariffs until they achieve a uniform low tariff rate, about 10 to 20%. 8. Domestic savings. Fiscal discipline, cutbacks in government spending, tax reform, and financial liberalization divert resources from the state to highly productive private sectors, where savings rates are higher. The neoclassical growth model, discussed later, emphasizes the importance of savings and capital formation for rapid economic development. 9. Foreign direct investment. Neoclassicists favor abolishing barriers to the entry of foreign firms. Additionally, foreign firms should compete with domestic firms on equal terms. 10. Privatization. State enterprises should be privatized. 11. Deregulation. Governments should abolish regulations that impede new firm entry and restrict competition unless safety or environmental protection justifies regulations. 12. Property rights. The legal system should provide secure property rights without excessive costs to all land, capital, and buildings. Williamson 1993. Williamson, 1993, prodded by both economists from Washington and LDCs, indicates that Washington Consensus is a misnomer, and that these policies more accurately reflect a universal convergence of DC and LDC, especially Latin American, capitals, albeit with support from the three major Washington institutions. Indeed, there is widespread, although not universal, consensus among economists favoring more reliance on market prices to improve the efficiency of resource allocation, monetary and fiscal discipline, improved tax administration, trade and exchange liberalization, and secure and exclusive user or property rights. Cutbacks in government spending may depress the economy, and usually require that spending on education, nutrition, and social services be reduced. Neoclassicals generally favor comprehensive change to liberalization, an immediate Big Bang or shock therapy rather than a gradual adjustment and price decontrol, market creation, reduction in government spending, monetary restriction, deregulation, legal changes, and privatization. Historical experience in the 19th century and 20th century West and Japan indicates that economic liberalization requires changes in economic institutions, which can only occur step by step. As the economic historian Douglas C. North, 1994, argued in his Nobel lecture, neoclassical theory is simply an inappropriate tool to analyze and prescribe policies that will induce development. It is concerned with the operation of markets, not with how markets develop. How can one prescribe policies when one doesn't understand how economies develop? According to Moises Naim, 2002, the Washington Consensus's core ideas are far better than the damaged brand that now emits the poisonous odors of a recipe concocted in Washington by a cabal of inept technocrats who are out of touch with the realities of poor countries or, even worse, are in the pockets of Wall Street. For Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, the net effect of the policies set by the Washington Consensus has all too often been to benefit the few at the expense of the many, the well-off at the expense of the poor. Washington Consensus, interpreted as the position of the IMF, World Bank, and U.S. administration, is inoperative today. The World Bank's increased focus on reducing LDC income inequality contrasts with the Bush administration's disdain for any concern about income distribution. Moreover, since the 1997-98 Asian crisis, the IMF has retreated on the necessity of capital account liberalization, whereas the U.S. administration, Williamson indicates, is using trade agreements to bully countries like Chile and Singapore into emasculating even the most enlightened capital controls. Finally, the IMF has disapproved of the U.S. administration's large budget deficits, whereas both the bank and fund have been critical of U.S. protectionism on agriculture, steel, and textiles. Robert Solow won a Nobel Prize for his formulation of the neoclassical theory of growth, which stressed the importance of savings and capital formation for economic development, and for empirical measures of sources of growth. Unlike the Herod-Dahmer model of growth which focused on capital formation, Solow allowed changes in wage and interest rates, substitutions of labor and capital for each other, variable factor proportions, and flexible factor prices. He showed that growth need not be unstable, because, as the labor force outgrew capital, wages would fall relative to the interest rate, or if capital outgrew labor, wages would rise. Factor price changes and factor substitution mitigated the departure from the razor's edge of the Herod-Dahmer growth path. Because aggregate growth refers to increases in total production, we can visualize growth factors if we examine the factors contributing to production. We do this in a production function stating the relationship between capacity output and the volume of various inputs. Solow used the following Cobb-Douglas production function, written in the 1920s by the mathematician Charles Cobb and the economist Paul Douglas, to distinguish among the sources of growth, labor quantity and quality, capital, and technology. The equation is y equals tk alpha L beta, where y is output or income, t the level of technology, k capital, and L labor. D is neutral in that it raises output from a given combination of capital and labor without affecting their relative marginal products. The parameter and exponent alpha is y/y, k/k, the elasticity, responsiveness, of output with respect to capital, holding labor constant. The symbol means increment in, so that, for example, y/y is the rate of growth of output and k/k the rate of growth of capital. The parameter beta is y/y, L/L, the elasticity of output with respect to labor, holding capital constant. If we assume alpha plus beta equals 1, which represents constant returns to scale, that is, a 1% increase in both capital and labor increases output by 1%, no matter what present output is, and perfect competition, so that production factors are paid their marginal products, then alpha also equals capital's share and beta labor's share of total income. Constant returns to scale, where output and all factors of production vary by the same proportion, still entail diminishing returns, where increments in output fall with each successive change in one variable factor. The Cobb-Douglas production function allows capital and labor to grow at different rates. The neoclassical model predicts that incomes per capita between rich and poor countries will converge. But empirical economists cannot find values for parameters and variables, such as alpha, beta, and capital formation rates, that are consistent with neoclassical equation and the evidence of lack of convergence. Without modification or augmentation, the Solow model is a poor predictor. Gregory Mankiw, David Romer, and David Weil, 1992, argue that although the direction of the variables, the growths in capital and labor, is correct, the magnitudes of these growths on income growth are excessive. These three economists propose an augmented Solow neoclassical model, which includes human capital as an additional explanatory variable to physical capital and labor. Human capital, as well as physical capital, can yield a stream of income over time. The Nobel economist Theodore W. Schultz, 1964, argues that a society can invest in its citizens through expenditures on education, training, research, and health that enhance their productive capacity. Although there are diminishing returns to physical capital by itself, there are constant returns to all, human and physical, capital. Lucas, 1998. Given the fact that such a large percentage of capital stock is human capital, Mankiw, Romer, and Weil, 1992, expected that adding a human capital variable, the fraction of the working-age population that attends secondary school, would improve the explanation of the model. Mankiw et al. Augmented model substantially reduces labor's share of income from about 0.60 to 0.33. They modify equation to y equals tk1/3l1/3h1/3, where h is human capital. H's positive correlation with savings rates and population growth substantially alters the results. Adding human capital, which explains 80% of the variation between rich and poor countries, does indeed give plausible values for the neoclassical growth model. Mankiw et al.'s model means that, with similar technologies and rates of capital and labor growths, income growth should converge, but much more slowly than that predicted by Solow's model. But although Mankiw et al. Salvaged the neoclassical growth model, it still has several weaknesses, including the assumptions that markets are perfectly competitive, essential for computing the marginal products that are components of alpha, beta, and the human capital exponent, that technological change is exogenous, explained outside the model, and that the level of technology is the same throughout the world. Indeed, neoclassical technical progress takes place completely independent of decisions by people, firms, and governments. The University of Chicago's Robert Lucas finds that international wage differences and migration are difficult to reconcile with neoclassical theory. If the same technology were available globally, skilled people embodying human capital would not move from LDCs, where human capital is scarce, to DCs, where human capital is abundant, as these people do now. Nor would a given worker be able to earn a higher wage after moving from the Philippines to the United States. Lucas, 1988, Romer, 1994. Moreover, Harvard's Robert Barrow and Xavier Salai Martin observe that diminishing returns to capital in the neoclassical model should mean substantial international capital movements from DCs, with high capital labor ratios, to LDCs, with low capital labor ratios. These capital movements should enhance the convergence found in Solow's model, in contrast to the lack of convergence found in the real world. Additionally, most LDCs attract no net capital inflows, and many LDCs even experience domestic capital flight. New growth theorists think their model is closer to the realities of international flows of people and capital than the neoclassical model. Paul Romer, 1994, believes that if technology is endogenous, explained within the model, economists can elucidate growth where the neoclassical model fails. When the level of technology is allowed to vary, you can explain more of growth, as DCs have higher level than LDCs. Variable technology means that the speed of convergence between DCs and LDCs is determined primarily by the rate of diffusion of knowledge. For new growth theorists such as Romer, innovation or technical change, the embodiment and production of some new idea or invention that enhances capital and labor productivity, is the engine of growth. The endogenous theorists, whose message is continuous technological innovation, are the strongest antidotes to the limits to growth. Neoclassical theorists assume that technological discoveries are global public goods, so that all people can use new technology at the same time. Indeed, it is technologically possible, but not historically accurate, for every person and firm to use the internal combustion engine, the transistor, the microcomputer, and other innovations. For new growth economists, however, technological discovery results from an LDC's government policies. The neoclassical growth theorists have no role for the state and industrial research. Neoclassical economists assume that the innovator receives no monopoly profits from their discoveries. However, because individuals and firms control information flows, petition for patents to restrict use by rivals, and charge prices for others to use the technology, new growth economists assume a temporary monopoly associated with innovation. Neoclassical economists emphasize capital formation. New growth economists, by contrast, stress external economies to capital accumulations that can permanently keep the marginal product of physical or human capital above the interest rate, and prevent diminishing returns from generating stagnation. Short summary. The English classical economist David Ricardo feared eventual stagnation from slow capital accumulation, and diminishing returns from population growth on fixed natural resources. However, he failed to see the possibility of sustained, rapid, economic growth because his theory understated scientific discoveries and technological progress. Marx saw history dialectically, as progressing from feudalism to capitalism to socialism on the basis of class conflict. The oppressed classes overthrow the classes controlling the prevailing means of production. Nevertheless, the socialist revolution did not take place in the most advanced capitalist countries, nor did workers overthrow capitalism when they became a majority of the labor force, as Marx expected. Rostow's economic model has 5 stages. Its central historical stage is the takeoff, a decisive period of increased investment, rapid growth in leading sectors, and institutional change during which the major blocks to steady growth are finally overcome. Rostow's theory has several weaknesses: insufficient empirical evidence concerning conditions needed for takeoff, imprecise definitions, no theoretical ground for a society's movement from one stage to another, and the mistaken assumption that economic development and LDCs will parallel the early stages of DC development. The vicious circle theory contends that a country is poor because its income is too low to encourage potential investors and generate adequate saving. However, high-income inequality, funds spent on prestige projects and the military, and numerous products requiring few economies of scale suggest that the savings potential of LDCs is much greater than this theory envisions. Balanced growth advocates argue that a big push is needed to begin economic development because of indivisibilities in demand and infrastructure. Critics indicate that most LDCs do not have the resources essential for launching such a big push. Hirschman supports a deliberate unbalancing of the economy to facilitate economic decision-making and investment. However, he fails to stress the importance of agricultural investment. Kramer's O-ring theory of development emphasizes that production consists of many tasks, all of which must be successfully completed for the product to have full value and to prevent coordination failure. For Lewis, economic growth takes place as a result of growth in the size of the industrial sector, which saves, relative to the subsistence agricultural sector, which saves nothing. In the Lewis model, an unlimited supply of surplus farm labor migrates to urban areas for wages in excess of rural, subsistence wages. This supply of cheap labor to the industrial sector is the basis for profits and capital accumulation. However, critics question Lewis's premise of zero marginal productivity of labor and believe that the capitalist wage rate will rise before all surplus rural labor is absorbed. Ranis, too, believe that the capitalist wage will increase before surplus labor is absorbed, unless agriculture and industry can achieve balanced growth. However, contrary to the Lewis-Ranis model, Japan raised its capitalist wage rate before all surplus rural labor was absorbed. For Baran, the coalition of the bourgeoisie and landed classes, helped by foreign capitalist governments, is incapable of undertaking the capital formation and political reform required for rapid economic growth and alleviation of mass poverty. Although Baran's vision of a ruling progressive coalition is intriguing, he underestimates the conflicts of interest and class antagonism that are likely to occur under its rule. Furtado's dependency theory contends that increased productivity and new consumption patterns resulting from capitalism in the peripheral countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America benefit a small ruling class and its allies. Frank's dependency approach maintains that countries become underdeveloped through integration into, not isolation from, the international capitalist system. However, despite some evidence supporting Frank, he does not adequately demonstrate that withdrawing from the capitalist system results in faster economic development. The neoclassical counter-revolution to Marxian and dependency theory emphasized reliance on the market, private initiative, and deregulation in LDCs. Neoclassical growth theory emphasizes the importance of increased saving for economic growth. The Washington institutions of the World Bank, IMF, and the U.S. government have applied neoclassical analysis in their policy-based lending to LDCs. The new endogenous growth theory arose from concerns that neoclassical economics neglected the explanations of technological change and accepted an unrealistic assumption of perfect competition. The new growth theory, however, does no better than an enhanced neoclassical model in measuring the sources of economic growth. Thanks for watching and subscribe for more videos.